Under His Terms. A romance audiobook. Chapter 1. If my nerves were fabric, they'd be a tangled ball of thread right now. The moment I stepped through the revolving glass doors of Alcantara Couture, it felt like entering another world. Everything shimmered literally, from the marble floors polished to a blinding sheen to the enormous chandelier, hanging above the lobby like a crown jewel. The place screamed, "You don't belong here." But I wasn't here to blend in. I was here to stand out. The reception desk was an imposing monolith of glass and steel, manned by a woman so perfect she could have walked straight off a runway. Her lipstick was an exact match to the Alcantara crimson I'd seen on last year's Fashion Week finale dress. She barely glanced at me before typing something into her computer. "Name?" she asked, her tone clipped enough to trim hedges. "Amelia Royce. I'm one of the new design interns," I replied, gripping the strap of my bag like a lifeline. She tapped a few keys before giving me a once-over. "5th floor. Someone will meet you by the elevators." The elevator ride felt like the ascent to heaven or doom. Each ding of the floors passing made my heart pound harder. When the doors opened to the design studio, the hum of creativity hit me like a wave. Everywhere, designers clustered around mannequins, draping fabric, sketching furiously, or arguing over swatches. The air smelled faintly of leather and ambition. I stood awkwardly at the edge of the room, clutching my bag as a woman in a sleek black jumpsuit and sky-high heels strutted toward me. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it probably qualified as an extreme sport. "You're the intern," she said, not bothering with introductions. "Follow me. Don't touch anything." Somewhere between being shown where not to put my bag and being handed a towering stack of fabric samples to alphabetize, yes, really I got my first real glimpse of him. Victor Alcantara. It happened when I was sent to deliver a package to the top floor, the domain of only the most elite staff. I had just placed the package on a glass table when a deep, commanding voice sliced through the room. "Explain to me why this design is 2 days behind schedule." I froze. Behind a long conference table sat a man who looked like he belonged in a museum, carved out of marble and tailored to perfection. His dark eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the designer, stammering an explanation across from him. His charcoal suit fit so impeccably it almost distracted from the quiet authority radiating off him. Almost. I was so busy gaping that I didn't notice the package had shifted precariously on the edge of the table. As if in slow motion, it tipped, fell, and landed with a loud thud. Every head in the room turned toward me, including his. I scrambled to pick it up, cheeks blazing. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." Victor's gaze landed on me, heavy and assessing. For a moment I swore the corners of his mouth twitched, like he was fighting a smile. Then he nodded toward the door. "Miss Royce," I blurted. "Amelia Royce, design intern." "Miss Royce, this floor is for executive meetings. Please ensure your deliveries are quieter in the future." I nodded furiously, clutching the package like a shield. "Absolutely." Silent as a whisper. "You won't even know I was here." The faintest hint of amusement flickered in his eyes before he returned to the designer's folder. "Good." As I hurried out of the room, heart pounding, one thought stuck with me: he noticed me. But whether that was a good thing or a very, very, very bad thing remained to be seen. The elevator doors closed behind me with an emphatic ding, but my heart still hadn't caught up. The package in my hands felt like a 10-ton brick. Or maybe that was just the weight of embarrassment crushing me. Victor Alcantara had looked at me, studied me with those eyes that could probably cut diamonds. And somehow, instead of making a professional impression, I'd managed to star in the office version of clumsy intern meets world-class CEO. Classic. I ducked into a quiet corner of the design studio, trying to collect myself. Around me, the symphony of Alcantara Couture hummed on. Designers barked commands at interns. Fabrics swished and shimmered in the fluorescent light. And somewhere, someone's voice was at full volume arguing about the depth of crimson. I should have been soaking it all in the creativity, the buzz, the glamour of working at the pinnacle of the fashion world. But all I could focus on was how small I felt, Royce, right? I glanced up to see Margaret Palmer, a senior designer with the kind of confidence that could make you question your life choices. She stood there with a clipboard in one hand and a lat in the other, looking like she'd stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. "Ah, yeah," I stammered, straightening. "Amelia Royce." Margot gave me a once-over that could only be described as surgical. Her perfectly arched brow lifted ever so slightly. "Ha. Cute shoes." I looked down at my bargain bin flats, suddenly wishing they'd disappear into the floor. "Thanks," I mumbled. Margot smirked, leaning in just enough to make me nervous. "Word of advice, newbie. Around here, people notice the details. Shoes, bags, how you carry yourself. If you're not careful, you'll be someone's cautionary tale before lunch." Before I could respond, she waltzed off, leaving the faint scent of expensive perfume in her wake. I exhaled, leaning back against the wall. It wasn't just my shoes. It was everything. My thrift store blazer with the fraying hem, my second-hand bag that had seen better days, the way I couldn't quite fit into the polished, glittering puzzle of Alcantara couture. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my bank app. The numbers didn't change from the last 5 times I'd checked. Not enough for a let alone a wardrobe overhaul. A sharp laugh rang out nearby, pulling me back to the present. Across the room, 2 assistants were discussing Victor's latest demands, their voices tinged with equal parts fear and fascination. He asked for a full redesign of the spring line overnight. "Overnight," one of them said, throwing up her hands. "Welcome to the Victor show," the other replied. "Better learn to keep up, or you're out." I chewed my lip, nerves coiling tighter. Was I really ready for this? The long hours, the impossible deadlines, the unspoken competition lurking behind every glossy smile. But then I glanced at a dress nearby, a masterpiece in shimmering silk and cascading pearls. It was pure magic, the kind of creation that made you believe in fairy tales. And I realized something. I hadn't come here to fit in. I'd come here to make things like that. Squaring my shoulders, I pushed off the wall. Sure, I wasn't rich or polished or wearing the latest designer heels, but I had something they couldn't measure in fabric swatches or price tags, a relentless drive to prove I belonged. Victor Alcantara could have his rules and his cutting stares. Margot Palmer could keep her clipboard and cryptic warnings. I was going to show them and myself that I had what it took. One way or another. Chapter 2. The lights backstage at the Alcantara Couture Winter Showcase buzzed with a frenetic energy that could have powered the entire city. Models swirled past in glittering gowns, assistants shouted about missing accessories, and somewhere in the chaos, a tray of champagne glasses crashed to the floor. I stood in the middle of it all, clutching a clipboard like it was my only anchor in a hurricane. This was my first big event. And I wasn't just a fish out of water, I was a fish in the middle of a desert, wearing heels that pinched like nobody's business. "Where is the centerpiece?" A voice barked, sharp as a needle. I turned to see Elise Carter, the senior event coordinator, glaring at the chaos like she could set it on fire with her mind. Her signature headset crackled as she snapped. "If that gown doesn't get here in the next 5 minutes, we might as well cancel the entire show." The centerpiece gown. Of course. The one everyone had been whispering about, the showstopper designed to close the event and leave the audience gasping. Except apparently it wasn't here. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a hiccup. This was a full-blown disaster. Elise stormed off, barking orders into her headset, and I knew what everyone else was thinking. Victor Alcantara wasn't going to be happy. I glanced at the clipboard in my hands. A quick skim of the inventory log told me what I needed to know. The gown hadn't been delivered to the venue, it was still at the atelier, stuck in limbo thanks to a clerical error. "Come on, Amelia," I muttered to myself. Think. Without overthinking it, I grabbed my phone and called the atelier. A breathless assistant confirmed my suspicions. The gown was packed. But the delivery team hadn't received the final address update. "Send it now," I said, trying to sound more authoritative than I felt. and make sure the driver takes the express route. I'll handle the logistics on this end. As soon as I hung up, I flagged down one of the stagehands, explaining the situation in rapid-fire sentences. He nodded and sprinted off to coordinate. My heart hammered as I calculated the timing. If the dress didn't arrive in the next 20 minutes, we'd have to rearrange the lineup. I was halfway through directing the revised order when I felt him before I saw him. Victor Alcantara's presence swept through the backstage chaos like a silent storm. Conversations hushed, assistants straightened their spines, and the energy shifted in an instant. He was dressed in a midnight black suit, his expression unreadable as his dark eyes scanned the room. When they landed on me, I froze like a deer in the headlights, clipboard clutched to my chest. "Miss Royce," he said, his voice low and smooth, yet commanding enough to cut through the noise. "What's going on?" I swallowed hard, but somehow my voice stayed steady. There was a mix-up with the centerpiece gown. "It's en route now, and I've adjusted the lineup to give it time to arrive." For a moment he said nothing. His gaze locked on mine. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks under the weight of his scrutiny. "Impressive," he said finally, his tone softer than I expected. "You managed all this on your own?" "Well, I might have roped a few people into helping," I said, attempting a light laugh. "But yes." A flicker of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, just enough to send a jolt through my chest. "Resourceful and quick under pressure," he murmured, almost to himself. "Two traits I value highly." I blinked, unsure how to respond. Before I could embarrass myself further, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'll need someone like you on my personal team. If you can handle tonight's chaos, you can handle anything." My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment the noise around us faded. Was he serious? "Thank you, Mr. Alcantara," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Victor," he corrected, his gaze lingering just a second longer than necessary before he turned and walked away, leaving me breathless in his wake. It wasn't until Elise stormed past, muttering about divas and deadlines, that the world came rushing back. I realized two things: the gown had arrived, and half the room was staring at me with a mix of envy and suspicion. Victor Alcantara had noticed me. Again. But this time it wasn't just a passing glance. This time he'd seen me, and I couldn't decide if that was thrilling or terrifying. Maybe a bit of both. The word opportunity buzzed in my head like a neon sign as I walked back to my little corner of the design studio. Victor's words were played on a loop, and with each repetition my heart alternated between racing and sinking. "I'll need someone like you on my personal team." Someone like me? Was he serious? Or was this some kind of test to see how much I could handle before crumbling under the pressure of Alcantara Couture's notoriously high standards? Either way, the offer was impossible to ignore. Still, the rumors I'd overheard about Victor Alcantara gave me pause. Whispers in the hallways, stolen conversations over coffee. He was a perfectionist to a fault, a man who demanded excellence at every turn. Assistants didn't last long, designers either flourished or burned out, and no one dared cross him. "Amelia." I nearly jumped out of my skin as Margaret Palmer's voice cut through my internal debate. She sauntered over, her heels clicking on the polished floor like tiny gunshots. "I heard about your little backstage triumph," she said, her tone saccharine with a side of snark. "Impressive." "Thanks," I said cautiously, unsure if it was a compliment or a trap. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So the boss noticed you. Lucky girl. Let me guess he asked you to join the inner sanctum." I blinked. "How did you all please?" She rolled her eyes dramatically. "Victor always finds a fresh face to test. The last assistant lasted 3 weeks before she quit and fled to Bali. The one before that, a month, tops. Word of advice, don't get too comfortable." "Why does everyone act like he's the Grim Reaper?" I asked, crossing my arms. "He can't be that bad." Margot leaned in conspiratorially. "He's worse. Victor doesn't just demand your best, he expects you to live and breathe his vision. If you mess up, he won't yell, he'll look at you like you've personally disappointed the universe. Trust me, it's soul-crushing." Her words lingered like a storm cloud. I glanced toward the glass-walled office on the far end of the floor, where Victor was speaking with Elise. Even from a distance, his presence was magnetic, commanding, intimidating. Of course, Margaret added with a shrug, if you're up for the challenge, it could open doors. Victor's proteges tend to go places if they survive. I spent the rest of the day oscillating between excitement and dread. Could I handle working directly for Victor Alcantara? Sure, I'd survive the chaos of the fashion show, but this was different. It wasn't a one-time test, it was a front-row seat to the storm that was Victor. By the time the day ended, my feet ached, my brain felt fried, and my bag was about 30 pounds heavier thanks to the stack of materials Elise had handed me to review before tomorrow. Royce, a voice called as I reached the elevator. I turned to see Elise, her sharp gaze pinning me in place. Yes? She stepped closer, crossing her arms. You should know what you're getting into if you accept Victor's offer. I hesitated, unsure if this was a pep talk or a warning. Victor is demanding, she said, her tone neutral but laced with meaning. He sees everything, misses nothing, and expects absolute precision. There's no room for error, no excuses. Got it, I said, straightening my shoulders. No, I don't think you do, Elise countered, her expression softening slightly. He's not just looking for an assistant, he's looking for someone who can anticipate his needs, solve problems before they happen, and keep up with him every step of the way. It's not for the faint of heart. Her words weighed heavy, but they also ignited a flicker of determination in me. I want to prove myself, I said, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. Elise studied me for a moment before nodding. Good, you'll need that attitude. Just remember Victor is always watching. The elevator doors slid open, and Elise stepped inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I descended to the ground floor, I clutched the strap of my bag and stared at my reflection in the mirrored walls. I could see the doubt in my eyes, but also something else. A spark of resolve. Victor Alcantara could be as demanding as he wanted. If I was going to survive in his world, I'd do it on my own terms. The elevator dinged, and I stepped out into the city night, ready for whatever came next. Or at least I hoped I was. Chapter 3. When Victor Alcantara said directly under me, I hadn't realized he meant literally every waking second. Day 1 on his team started at 6 a.m. sharp. By the time I arrived at his office, an impossibly sleek, glass-walled sanctuary with the kind of view that makes your soul feel inadequate, he was already there, perfectly composed, reviewing fabric swatches as though the fate of the universe depended on finding the exact shade of obsidian black. Miss Royce, he greeted without looking up. Good morning, Mr. Alcantara, I said, careful not to trip over my words or my feet. It's Victor, he corrected, his voice smooth but firm. If you're going to work with me, you'll need to keep up. That includes the pace and the protocols. Understand? I nodded, even though my brain was screaming, keep up. I can barely keep breathing right now. He handed me a tablet filled with today's agenda, the items listed with military precision. Meetings with designers, a photo shoot for an upcoming campaign, a dinner with investors, and that was just before lunch. By noon, I'd learned 3 things about Victor Alcantara. 1. He was obsessed with details. Every line of stitching, every fold of fabric, every inch of a design mattered to him. Watching him critique a new gown was like witnessing a sculptor carve marble, brutally exacting, yet weirdly mesmerizing. 2. He hated inefficiency. I once hesitated for 2 seconds too long before answering a question, and the look he gave me could have melted glaciers. 3. Beneath the icy exterior, there were flashes of something different. It happened in tiny moments, like when a seamstress burst into tears after accidentally spilling coffee on a completed gown. While everyone else braced for the explosion, Victor simply handed her a tissue and said, "Take a breath. Fix it. It'll be fine." His tone was calm, almost kind, or the way his eyes softened ever so slightly when he saw an assistant struggling with a heavy load of fabric bolts. He didn't say anything, just took the bolts from her and carried them to the worktable himself. It was disarming, seeing glimpses of the man behind the perfectionist facade. The whirlwind didn't stop. By the time we arrived at the campaign photoshoot, I was running on caffeine and adrenaline. Models posed under bright lights, photographers barked orders, and Victor orchestrated the chaos like a maestro conducting a symphony. "Miss Royce," he said, beckoning me over as I adjusted a rack of garments. "Yes, Victor?" I asked, trying to sound composed despite the fact that my heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the hectic schedule. He handed me a garment bag. "This dress needs to be on her in 5 minutes," he said, nodding toward the lead model. "The lighting is shifting, and I won't waste a second." "Got it," I said, hurrying off to the dressing area. Later, as the sun set over the city, we found ourselves in the back of his sleek black car, en route to dinner with investors. I was reviewing notes on my tablet when I felt his gaze. "Amelia," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. I looked up, startled to hear my first name. "You handled today well?" he said, his tone softer than I'd ever heard it. "Not many people can keep up their first day." "Thank you," I replied, trying to suppress a smile. "It wasn't easy, but I survived." His lips quirked, just enough to suggest a smile. "You'll find that survival is half the battle. The other half is thriving." "Sounds intense," I said, meeting his gaze. "With me, it is," he said simply, his voice low, his eyes unwavering. The car pulled to a stop, breaking the moment, but as I stepped out into the crisp evening air, his words stayed with me, their weight settling in my chest. Victor Alcantara wasn't just a boss. He was a force of nature, and as much as it scared me, part of me was intrigued. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to thrive. The second day of working directly under Victor Alcantara began with an email at precisely 5:59 a.m. Not 6, not 5:58, exactly 5:59. The subject line read, "Meeting in my office." 7 sharp. By now, I'd learned that sharp wasn't a suggestion, it was a promise. When I arrived at his office, I found Victor standing by the window, silhouetted against the early morning skyline. He didn't turn as I entered, and for a moment I felt like I'd stepped into some glossy magazine photo shoot. "Sit," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. I perched on the edge of one of the sleek leather chairs opposite his desk, clutching my notebook like a shield. Victor finally turned, his dark eyes locking onto mine as he crossed the room and sat across from me. "Miss Royce," he began, his tone measured, "I believe in clarity, so let me be clear about what working with me entails." Here it comes, I thought, bracing myself. This is not a job for the faint of heart. I expect absolute professionalism, unwavering loyalty, and complete confidentiality. Everything you see here and do while working for me stays within these walls. "Understood." I nodded, though my throat felt suddenly dry. He continued, his gaze steady and unyielding. "There are also boundaries. Personal relationships, whether between colleagues or between you and me, are out of the question. My world is built on precision and focus, and I will not tolerate distractions." My heart skipped, and not in the romantic way. Personal relationships, between us? Was that a common concern with his assistants, or was this some preemptive warning? "Yes, Victor," I said, my voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside me. "I understand." He leaned back slightly, his posture as composed as ever. "Good. I also value resourcefulness, initiative, and discretion. You showed those qualities yesterday, which is why you're here. But the pace we operate at is relentless, and any misstep can have serious consequences. If at any point you feel this role is too much for you, I expect you to step down gracefully. Is that clear?" I nodded again, though my mind was racing. It was impossible to tell if this was his version of a pep talk or a warning or both. "Crystal clear," I said, forcing a small smile. For a brief moment, something flickered across his expression approval. Curiosity? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Very well," he said, standing. "You can go. Your schedule for today has already been sent." Be prepared. I stood too, clutching my notebook like a lifeline. As I turned to leave, I paused. Victor. He raised a brow, waiting. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I won't let you down. His lips quirked into the faintest shadow of a smile. I don't expect you to. As I left his office, the door clicking shut behind me, I felt a swirl of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Victor's world was intense, precise, and demanding just like him. And while his rules felt like a fortress designed to keep people out, there was something about him that made me want to stay. Maybe it was the opportunity. Maybe it was the challenge. Or maybe it was him. Whatever it was, I had a feeling this job was going to be more than I'd bargained for. The Alcantara Gala was a spectacle of glittering lights and whispered wealth, the kind of event where champagne flowed like water and laughter tinkled like crystal. I stood near the entrance, trying not to gape at the grand ballroom. Chandeliers dripped with light, and every surface seemed to shimmer, from the polished marble floors to the sequins on the guests' designer gowns. Victor had been right, this was a test, and I was determined to pass it. Miss Royce, his smooth voice came from behind me, making my heart leap. I turned, only to find myself momentarily speechless. Victor Alcantara wasn't just impeccably dressed. He looked like the embodiment of confidence and control. His midnight black tuxedo fit him like a second skin, and his sharp gaze swept over me, assessing. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Always," I replied, channeling a bravado I definitely didn't feel. He arched a brow, clearly unimpressed by my attempt at humor. "Good, because tonight there's no room for error." The evening blurred into a whirlwind of introductions, handshakes, and carefully curated smiles. Victor moved through the crowd with the ease of a king surveying his kingdom, and I trailed behind him, taking mental notes on names and faces. At one point, a guest, a stern-looking man with a salt and pepper beard, approached Victor with a complaint about a delayed shipment of couture pieces. Victor's jaw tightened, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. "The delay was caused by unforeseen circumstances, Mr. Bouchard," he said evenly. "However, I've already ensured that your order will arrive within the next 24 hours. Bouchard didn't look convinced. "That's not good enough. My clients are expecting." "Excuse me," I interrupted before my nerves could catch up with me. Both men turned to me, and I swallowed hard but pressed on. "We actually arranged for a courier to deliver an exclusive accessory collection with the order. It's meant to complement the pieces perfectly. I think your clients will be delighted." Bouchard blinked, his irritation momentarily replaced by surprise. Victor's eyes flicked to me, sharp and unreadable. Bouchard said, his tone softening. "I suppose that could work." He turned back to Victor with a grudging nod. "Fine. I'll await the delivery." As he walked away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Well done," Victor said quietly, his tone laced with approval. "Thanks," I replied, trying not to bask too obviously in the praise. Later, as the night wound down, Victor turned to me. "Follow me," he said, his voice low. I followed him to a quieter part of the ballroom, where the crowd thinned, and the music softened into something slow and intimate. He stopped, turned, and extended a hand. "Dance with me," he said. I blinked, caught completely off guard. "Is this part of the test?" "Let's call it a moment to recalibrate," he replied, his lips quirking into the faintest hint of a smile. Hesitantly, I placed my hand in his, and he guided me onto the dance floor. The warmth of his touch sent a small jolt through me, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. As we moved to the music, the world seemed to blur and fade. The chandeliers glimmered like stars, and the soft strains of the orchestra ran around us like a spell. "You handled tonight better than I expected," he said, his voice low and close enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Is that your way of saying I passed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Let's just say you've earned your place," he replied, his dark eyes holding mine. The way he looked at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with the music. For a moment, the tension between us was almost tangible, crackling like static electricity. But just as I opened my mouth to say something, Victor stepped back, his hand releasing mine. "Good night, Miss Royce," he said, his expression unreadable once more. As he walked away, leaving me standing there under the glittering chandeliers, I couldn't decide if I'd just survived my first test or failed a far more dangerous one. Chapter 4. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was sure I'd turned into a pumpkin, or maybe just a very sleep-deprived intern clinging to her sanity with one hand and a steaming cup of coffee with the other. The Alcantara studio was eerily quiet for once, the chaos of the day replaced by the hum of machines and the faint shuffle of papers. I sat at the large worktable in the corner, surrounded by sketches, swatches, and a growing pile of discarded ideas. Victor was across the room, his sleeves rolled up, a shocking departure from his usual polished armor. His tie had been abandoned hours ago, and his hair was slightly mussed, as though he'd run his fingers through it one too many times. If I didn't know any better, I'd say he looked almost human. "Miss Royce," he called, his voice breaking through the quiet. I straightened immediately, setting my coffee aside. "Yes, Victor." He gestured for me to join him, and I hurried over, trying not to look as exhausted as I felt. He held up a sketch, his brow furrowed. "This neckline," he said, pointing at the design. "It's close, but it's not right. What's missing?" I stared at the sketch, my brain scrambling to come up with an answer. "It's too structured," I said finally. "The gown has this softness to it, but the neckline feels too harsh. Maybe something more organic? A draped effect?" Victor looked at me, his dark eyes locking onto mine in that unnerving way he had. "Interesting," he murmured. "Show me." Before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed a nearby roll of fabric and draped it over the mannequin, adjusting it until it matched the image in my mind. Victor watched in silence, his gaze sharp and focused. When I stepped back, he studied the result for a long moment before nodding. "Better. Much better." His tone was approving, but there was something else, something softer that caught me off guard. "You're good at this," he said suddenly, his voice quieter than usual. The unexpected compliment left me momentarily speechless. "Thank you," I managed, my cheeks warming. Victor leaned against the worktable, his posture uncharacteristically relaxed. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said, almost to himself. I blinked. Victor Alcantara, the man of steel and precision, was reminiscing. "Who?" I asked before I could stop myself. He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the sketch in his hand. "My mother," he said finally. "She was the one who taught me to see the details, to care about the small things that make something extraordinary." I blinked again, unsure how to respond. This was a side of Victor I'd never seen before, vulnerable, almost wistful. "She used to say," he continued, his voice soft, "that true beauty is in the imperfections. It's what makes something or someone unique." The air between us felt different, heavier somehow. I wanted to ask more, to keep him talking, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was the look of someone who had opened a door they weren't quite ready to walk through. "Anyway," he said, straightening and slipping back into his usual composed demeanor, "we still have work to do." I nodded, retreating to my corner of the table. But as I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, or the man beneath the polished exterior, who had let his guard down, if only for a moment. Victor Alcantara was a puzzle I wasn't sure I'd ever solve. But that didn't stop me from wanting to try. The industry gala was held at an Art Deco hotel so opulent it practically screamed money and influence. The kind of place where even the champagne looked smug. I had spent the better part of the evening clinging to the edge of the room, trying to avoid stepping on the hems of glittering gowns or getting in the way of tuxedo-clad waiters carrying trays of canapes. Victor, of course, moved through the crowd like a monarch among peasants, exuding charm and authority in equal measure. I had just begun to relax, sipping what I hoped was sparkling water and not actual diamonds, when I felt a presence beside me. "Miss Royce, isn't it?" The man was tall and broad-shouldered with a grin that was more predatory than friendly. I recognized him immediately. Lucas Jennings, one of Victor's rivals. His name came up in hushed conversations, usually accompanied by words like ruthless and conniving. "Yes," I replied, careful to keep my tone polite. "You're the intern turned protege everyone's whispering about," Lucas said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Victor must see something very unique in you. The way he said it made my stomach twist. "I'm here to do my job, Mr. Jennings," I said evenly. He chuckled, low and condescending. "Oh, I'm sure. But let me give you some advice, Amelia." His voice dropped as he leaned closer, his cologne cloying. "Victor Alcantara doesn't keep anyone around unless they're useful. And when you stop being useful, you're—" "Is there a problem here?" Victor's voice cut through the air like a blade, smooth but edged with steel. He appeared at my side, his dark eyes fixed on Lucas with an intensity that made the other man step back. "Victor," Lucas said, recovering quickly. "We were just chatting, getting to know each other." "Funny," Victor said, his tone icy, "because it looked like you were making my assistant uncomfortable." Lucas's grin faltered, but he quickly plastered it back on, just offering some friendly advice. "No harm done." Victor stepped closer, his presence almost suffocating. "If you have advice, Lucas, perhaps you should keep it to yourself. Amelia doesn't need your opinions, friendly or otherwise." The tension between them was palpable, and I suddenly felt like I was standing between two gladiators in an arena. "Of course," Lucas said smoothly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Enjoy your evening." As he walked away, I realized I was gripping my clutch so tightly my fingers ached. "Are you all right?" Victor asked, his voice softening as he turned to me. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my heart was still racing. "Good," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. Then, as if sensing the growing attention of nearby guests, he leaned in and lowered his voice. "Walk with me," he said. He led me onto a terrace overlooking the city, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the heat rising in my cheeks. The distant hum of the gala faded as we stood in the quiet, the lights of the city stretching out before us. "Lucas Jennings is an opportunist," Victor said, his tone clipped. "Don't let him get to you." "I won't," I replied, glancing at him. "But you didn't have to step in like that." His lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yes, I did." The way he said it, low and deliberate, made my breath hitch. "Victor," I began, but he turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. "Amelia," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "You're here because you earned your place. Don't let anyone, least of all someone like Lucas, make you doubt that." I swallowed hard, caught in the intensity of his gaze. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment the world seemed to fall away. The city lights, the sounds of the gala, the cool breeze, all of it faded, until there was only him. His gaze dipped briefly, almost imperceptibly, to my lips before he stepped back, breaking the spell. "Come," he said, his voice cool again, though there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "We shouldn't give them more to gossip about." As we returned to the gala, the stares and murmurs of the guests followed us like a spotlight. But I didn't care, because for the first time I saw something in Victor that went beyond control and precision, something I wasn't ready to name. But it made my heart race all the same. The car ride back from the gala was quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't comfortable but charged, like a thunderstorm waiting to strike. Victor sat beside me, his gaze fixed on the city lights flashing by, his profile sharp and unreadable. I wanted to say something. Anything. But the words tangled in my throat. It wasn't until we stepped into the Alcantara building, his sanctuary of glass and steel, that the tension broke. "Stay," Victor said, his voice low as the elevator doors closed behind us. "We need to talk." His tone wasn't a request. It was a command. I crossed my arms, keeping my chin high. "About what?" He didn't answer until we were in his office. The space was quiet, the city spread out like a glittering sea beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Lucas Jennings," he said finally, turning to face me. "What happened tonight wasn't my fault," I interrupted, my words sharper than I intended. Victor blinked, his brows lifting slightly in surprise. "I didn't say it was." "Well, it felt like you were about to," I shot back, heat rising in my chest. "You swooped in like some kind of knight in shining armor, but now I'm the one left to deal with the gossip." "Do you know what they're saying about us, Victor?" He stepped closer, his presence looming, but not intimidating, more like a force you couldn't ignore. "I don't care what they're saying." "Well, I do," I snapped, throwing my hands up. "I'm already walking on eggshells trying to prove I belong here, and now I'm the intern everyone thinks is." I stopped short, my throat tightening around the words. "Is what?" he asked, his voice dropping a fraction. I bit my lip, refusing to meet his gaze. "Is only here because of you." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. "You're not," he said finally, his tone softer but no less firm. "You're here because you're talented, because you've proven yourself capable." "Then why do you treat me like this?" I demanded, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Like I'm just another piece on your chessboard, another tool to help you maintain your perfect empire?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought I'd gone too far. But then he took a slow step back, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of frustration. "You think that's what this is?" he asked, his voice low but edged with something I couldn't quite place. "You think I don't value you?" "I don't know what to think," I admitted, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and something else, something raw and vulnerable. "You're so focused on control, on rules, on keeping everything in its place. Where does that leave me? What am I to you, Victor?" He stared at me, his expression a storm of emotions I couldn't decipher. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but laced with conviction. "You're not a tool, Amelia," he said. Here he stopped, as if the words were caught somewhere between his mind and his mouth. "You're more than that." I blinked, caught off guard by the intensity in his tone. "You have no idea what you're asking of me," he said, his gaze piercing. This isn't supposed to happen. I told you the rules for a reason." "And maybe I don't like your rules," I shot back, the fire in my chest reknitting. His lips twitched, not quite a smile but not quite a frown either. "Of course you don't," he murmured, almost to himself. The air between us felt electric, charged with every word we weren't saying. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to look him in the eye. "I'm not here to just survive, Victor," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I'm here to matter. If you can't see that, then maybe this isn't the right place for me." His jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But instead he turned away, his hands braced on the edge of his desk. "You matter more than you realize," he said quietly, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. I stared at his back, my heart pounding. I wanted to push him, to demand more, but something about the way his shoulders slumped stopped me. "Good night, Victor," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. As I left his office, the door clicking shut behind me, I realized something that both terrified and thrilled me. Victor Alcantara wasn't just a puzzle. He was a risk. Chapter 5. Late nights at Alcantara Couture had become the norm. The studio was quiet now, except for the rhythmic scratching of my pen against the endless notes Victor had left for me to organize. His immaculate handwriting somehow managed to convey both brilliance and impatience, a fitting metaphor for the man himself. I was rifling through a stack of portfolios in his office, hunting for a reference he'd mentioned in passing, when my fingers brushed against something unexpected. Tucked beneath a pile of sleek leather folders was an old journal. Its cover was weathered, the once rich leather faded and scuffed. It looked completely out of place in Victor's meticulously curated world, like a relic from another life. I glanced toward the door, half expecting Victor to stride in, his dark eyes narrowing at my curiosity. But the office was still. Carefully I opened the journal, its spine creaking softly. The pages were filled with sketches, not the precise, polished designs I'd come to associate with Victor, but raw, emotional pieces. Dresses with flowing lines, delicate patterns, and intricate details that seemed almost wistful. At the back of the journal, a photo slipped loose and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, holding it gingerly. It was a black and white picture of a woman, her face soft and kind, her eyes bright with determination. She was standing in what looked like an atelier, surrounded by bolts of fabric and sewing machines. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Who are you?" "She's my mother." The voice behind me was calm, but it made me jump like I'd been caught stealing. I turned to find Victor leaning against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the journal in my hands. I didn't mean to snoop," I stammered, clutching the photo as if it might explain itself. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "You didn't snoop. I should have put that away." There was no anger in his voice, but there was something else, something heavier. "She was a designer?" I asked, holding up the photo. Victor nodded, taking the picture from me with surprising gentleness. "She was the best I've ever known. Everything I learned about this world, about beauty, precision, and passion, I learned from her." I hesitated, unsure if I should press further. But something in his expression, a mix of longing and sadness, made me ask, "What happened to her?" He exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. "She passed away when I was 19. Cancer." It was fast, too fast. The weight of his words settled between us, and for once, I didn't know what to say. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, created something flawless enough, it would somehow honor her, that it would make up for not being able to save her. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, like he was wrestling with the memory. "Victor," I said softly, stepping closer. "You don't have to carry that alone." He looked at me then, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I made rules for a reason, Amelia. They keep things in order. They keep me focused." "And keep everyone at a distance," I added, unable to stop myself. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he reached out, gently taking the journal from my hands and placing it on his desk. "Some distances are necessary," he said, his voice low. "Not all of them," I countered, my tone just as soft. For a moment we stood there, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Then, just as quickly as he'd let his guard down, it was back up. "You should go home," he said, stepping back. "It's late." I wanted to argue, to tell him that he didn't have to close himself off, but something in his expression told me he wasn't ready. "Good night, Victor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As I left the office, the image of the woman in the photo stayed with me, her eyes so much like Victor's, bright, determined, and carrying the weight of something deeper. For the first time, I understood the man behind the rules, and for the first time, I realized just how dangerous it was to care. It started with the rain. The sudden downpour caught us off guard as we left the Alcantara offices late that night. Victor, ever composed, had offered me his umbrella without a second thought. But by the time we reached the car waiting at the curb, we were both half soaked, my hair sticking to my face in unruly waves. He held the umbrella over me as I slid into the sleek black car. Then followed, folding the dripping fabric with the kind of precise movements that seemed second nature to him. "Perfect timing," I muttered, wringing out the hem of my jacket. Victor's lips quirked, not quite a smile but close enough to feel like a reward. "A little rain never hurt anyone." "Easy for you to say," I shot back. "Your suits probably come with built-in weather resistance." That earned a low chuckle, warm and surprising in the quiet of the car. The driver started the engine, and the soft hum filled the space as we eased into the night. I felt Victor's gaze on me before I looked up. His dark eyes were steady, but there was something different about them tonight, softer, less guarded. "Amelia," he said, my name a quiet weight in the air. "Yes?" I asked, my heart suddenly racing. "You've been remarkable," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "The way you handled tonight, the way you've handled everything, it's more than I expected." My pulse hammered in my ears. "Victor, you don't have to say that. I mean it," he said, leaning slightly closer. "You've challenged me, pushed me in ways I didn't think possible." He stopped, his gaze flicking to my lips. My breath caught. The air between us felt electric, charged with every unspoken word, every moment we'd been circling each other since the day we met. And then, before I could think, before I could breathe, he closed the distance. His lips were warm, firm, and entirely unexpected. The kiss wasn't hesitant or careful, it was desperate, like he'd been holding back for too long, and finally let the dam break. I melted into it, my hands instinctively gripping the lapels of his jacket. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no rain, no rules, no expectations, just us. But just as quickly as it began, it ended. Victor pulled back, his breath ragged, his expression a mix of longing and regret. "I can't," he said, his voice barely audible. "I shouldn't have, Victor," I began, but he shook his head, his walls snapping back into place. "This was a mistake," he said, turning away. "It can't happen again." The words stung, sharper than I expected. I stared at him, my chest tightening as he retreated into himself, his posture stiff and unyielding. The rest of the ride passed in silence, the unspoken tension hanging between us like a storm cloud. When I got home, I couldn't stop pacing. The kiss replayed in my mind, over and over, until it felt like it was burned into my memory. What had I been thinking? What had he been thinking? Victor Alcantara was a man of rules, precision, and control, and I had just shattered the fragile balance we'd built. The worst part was, I didn't even regret it. But his words echoed in my head. It was a mistake. It can't happen again. The thought made my chest ache. I wasn't sure if it was anger, disappointment, or something else entirely, but it was suffocating. I sat on the edge of my bed, my head in my hands. Maybe it was time to walk away. I'd been holding on to this job, this world with both hands, but was it worth it? Victor's walls were so high, his rules so rigid, that I wasn't sure there was room for me in his perfectly constructed empire. And yet, when I closed my eyes, all I could see was the look in his eyes before he kissed me. The vulnerability, the longing, things he would never say out loud but had spoken in that moment. Across the city, Victor sat in his office, the rain still pattering against the windows. He stared at the journal on his desk, the photo of his mother tucked safely inside. He thought of Amelia, her fire, her resilience, the way she'd pushed past every barrier he'd put in her way. And the kiss. He closed his eyes, his fists clenching at his sides. He'd broken his own rules, let her slip past the armor he'd spent years perfecting. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push her from his mind. She was already too close. Chapter 6. It all started with a text. I was halfway through reorganizing the chaos that was the Alcantara Couture inventory list when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting a reminder or an update from Elise. Instead, my stomach sank as I read the message. Check the press. Now. The text came from Margot, which already set my nerves on edge. With shaking hands, I opened a news app and froze as the headline stared back at me. Exclusive. Alcantara's spring line leaked. Below the headline was a photo of one of Victor's centerpiece designs, something we'd finalized just days ago. My heart pounded as I read the article, each line more damning than the last. Confidential sketches, insider notes, even details about the fabric choices, everything had been exposed. My breath caught when I reached the end. Sources close to the team point to an ambitious intern as the likely culprit. Victor's office was colder than usual when I stepped inside. He sat behind his desk, his expression carved from stone, the leaked sketches displayed on his screen. "Close the door," he said without looking up. I obeyed, my legs feeling like jelly as I stepped forward. "Victor, don't," he cut me off, his voice sharp enough to slice through glass. "Do you have any idea what this means for the brand? For me? I didn't do it, I said firmly, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. He finally looked up, his dark eyes piercing. The press seems to think otherwise. And the files were accessed under your login credentials. That's impossible. I exclaimed, my chest tightening. I would never. Then explain it, he demanded, rising to his feet. The weight of his doubt hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd worked so hard to prove myself, to earn his trust, and now it felt like it was unraveling in an instant. I don't know how it happened, I said, my voice quieter now. But you have to believe me. I would never betray you or this company. Victor's jaw clenched, his gaze hard and unreadable. This isn't about belief, Amelia. It's about evidence. And right now, the evidence isn't in your favor. The words stung, sharp and cruel. Is that all I am to you? I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. Someone who can be discarded the moment things get messy? His silence was deafening. Fine, I said, my heart breaking as I turned toward the door. If you won't believe me, then maybe I don't belong here after all. The walk back to my desk felt like trudging through quicksand. Eyes followed me as I moved through the studio, whispers trailing in my wake like a storm cloud. Did you hear? She's the one who leaked it. I always thought she was too ambitious for her own good. I clenched my fists, fighting the sting of tears. I hadn't done it, but the weight of everyone's judgment felt as heavy as if I had. By the time I reached my desk, Margot was leaning casually against it, a smug smile playing on her lips. Tough break, Royce, she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. But hey, at least you're famous now. I shot her a glare, my mind racing. She was enjoying this too much, and it sent a spark of suspicion through me. What did you do? I demanded, stepping closer. Margot's smile didn't falter. Me? Why would I do anything? It's not my fault if people think you're the leak. My blood boiled, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I needed to figure out who was behind this and fast. Back in his office, Victor stood by the window, staring out at the city. His chest felt heavy with something he couldn't name. Guilt? Frustration? The image of Amelia's stricken face flashed in his mind, and he clenched his fists. He wanted to believe her. Hell, he did believe her. But years of running a business in an industry full of backstabbing had made him wary, too quick to doubt. You're a fool, Victor, he muttered to himself, turning back to his desk. And yet, somewhere deep down, a nagging voice told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I wasn't about to let Margot or anyone else ruin my career. If Victor wouldn't believe me, I'd prove it myself. The studio was still buzzing with whispers when I slipped back to my desk. Every stolen glance, every hushed conversation sent my blood boiling, but I forced myself to focus. If someone had framed me, they must have left breadcrumbs, and I was going to find them. I pulled up the access logs for the company's server, scrolling through the endless timestamps. My login had been used to access the files, but I hadn't touched them. The only way that was possible? Someone had used a shared terminal. The studio had a communal desk tucked away in the far corner, where interns and assistants often worked. It was quiet, forgotten, and more importantly not monitored as closely. My pulse quickened. If the files had been accessed from there, I might just have my first lead. By the time I reached the terminal, the studio was mostly empty, save for a few die-hard designers. I slid into the chair, pulling up the logs again. Sure enough, the files had been accessed from this terminal late last night. Got you, I whispered under my breath, my fingers flying across the keyboard. It didn't take long to find what I needed. The culprit hadn't bothered to delete the cache, and a familiar name glared back at me like a neon sign, Margot Palmer. I leaned back in the chair, a mix of relief and rage coursing through me. Margot had framed me, probably hoping to climb her way higher by stepping on my reputation. But I wasn't about to let her get away with it. The next morning, I stormed into Victor's office, armed with a printed log of evidence and a determination that felt sharper than ever. He looked up from his desk, his expression as cool and unreadable as always. Amelia, he said evenly, what is it? I I placed the folder on his desk with a satisfying thud. Proof, I said, my voice steady, that I didn't leak the designs. Victor's brow furrowed as he opened the folder, scanning the pages. His gaze darkened as he pieced it together, the tension in his jaw telling me everything I needed to know. Margot, he murmured, his tone dangerously low. She accessed the files from the communal terminal, I explained. I traced her login and matched it to the timestamps. She set me up. Victor's hand tightened on the papers before he placed them down carefully, his movements precise but loaded with emotion. Amelia, You doubted me, I said, cutting him off, my voice firmer than I expected. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. After everything I've done, after everything I've shown you, you still didn't trust me. He flinched, just barely, but I caught it. For the first time, Victor Alcantara, the man who never cracked under pressure, looked vulnerable. You're right, he said finally, his voice quieter now. I let my own mistrust cloud my judgment, and for that, I owe you an apology. I blinked, thrown off by the raw honesty in his tone. You owe me more than that, Victor. You owe me respect. He met my gaze, his eyes dark and searching. You've earned far more than my respect, Amelia. You've earned my loyalty. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to keep pushing, to make him feel the hurt I'd carried since the accusation. But the other part, the part that still cared, recognized the weight of what he was saying. Thank you, I said finally, my voice softer now. Victor nodded, his expression resolute. Margot will be dealt with immediately. And as for you, he paused, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. You've proven yourself in ways no one else ever has. Don't ever doubt how much you matter to this company or to me. His words sent a rush of heat to my cheeks, and I quickly looked away, clearing my throat. Good. Because I'm not going anywhere. Victor's lips quirked, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through. I didn't think you would. As I left his office, I felt lighter, freer. I'd cleared my name, proven my worth, and even forced Victor Alcantara to confront his trust issues. But as the door clicked shut behind me, one thought lingered in my mind. What exactly do I mean to him? The rest of the day passed in a blur, though the knot of frustration in my chest didn't loosen, not even after Victor's apology. He'd admitted his mistake, sure, but the sting of his doubt still lingered, sharp and raw. I wasn't sure if words could fix the damage. As I packed my things that evening, I tried not to dwell on it. I'd cleared my name. Margot would face the consequences. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. It wasn't just the accusation. It was the realization that Victor's world, the rules, the precision, the constant need to prove myself might be more than I could handle. Miss Royce, Elise's voice cut through my thoughts, jolting me back to the present. She stood in the doorway of the design studio, holding a small, elegantly wrapped box. This came for you, she said, placing it on my desk with a raised brow. Victor insisted it be delivered immediately. The knot in my chest tightened. Did he say why? Elise smirked faintly. He doesn't explain himself to me, but judging by the look on his face, I'd guess it's important. Have a good night. She disappeared before I could respond, leaving me alone with the mysterious package. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the ribbon. Part of me wanted to leave it untouched, to walk away and let it remain a mystery. But curiosity and maybe a little hope got the better of me. Carefully, I tugged at the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was a stunning fountain pen, sleek and weighty, with my initials engraved on the side. Beneath it was a folded note, written in Victor's precise handwriting. Amelia? For signing deals you'll someday make in rooms even I won't be able to enter. You've proven you belong here. Don't let anyone, including me, make you doubt it again. Victor, my breath hitched. The gesture was unexpected, thoughtful, and entirely unlike the Victor Alcantara I thought I knew. For a moment I just stared at the note, the weight of his words sinking in. He'd admitted his fault, extended an olive branch, and even offered a glimpse of faith in my potential. But was it enough? The truth was, Victor's world was intoxicating, its glamour, its challenges, even its chaos. But it was also draining, demanding, and relentless. And him. He was the most complicated part of all. Could I keep walking this tightrope, balancing my ambition with the emotional toll his world demanded? Could I survive the push and pull of a man who built walls faster than I could climb them? I wasn't sure. Clutching the pen in my hand, I felt a storm of emotions swirl inside me: gratitude, frustration, hope, and doubt, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. The only thing I knew for certain was that Victor's words, his gesture, his faith in me, they weren't the end of the story. They were just the beginning of another chapter. And whether I could survive in his world, under his terms, was a question I still didn't have the answer to.